we'd like to welcome you to our first Faculty Speakers Series event of the 2015-16 school year, so welcome. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker this evening. Heidi Schlumpf received her undergraduate degree in journalism from Notre Dame, her master's degree from the Theological Seminary at Northwestern University, and is currently an associate professor here at Aurora University. She's authored a book, While We Wait, Spiritual and Practical Advice for Those Trying to Adopt, and edited the Notre Dame Book of Prayers. Heidi regularly blogs for and writes a monthly column on popular culture for the National Catholic Reporter and articles for U.S. Catholic. She's received numerous awards for her journalism, including twice the Eileen Egan Journalism Award from Catholic Relief Services, and she will be covering or commentating on Pope Francis's visit to the U.S. next week. And tonight she'll be sharing her insight into Pope Francis and his relationship to U.S. Catholicism. So please welcome Heidi Schlumpf.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you everyone for coming tonight. Welcome to Pope Fest, Pope Mania, Pope-a-palooza, if you will. Whatever you call it, the excitement is brewing because the countdown to the Pope's arrival, Pope Francis's first trip to the United States, has started, and he's set to arrive in our nation's capital in less than a week. So the news media and entrepreneurs are excited. So witness all these papal souvenirs. We have the papal doll, the papal bobblehead, we even have the papal toaster and clock. My favorite, personal favorite, the Frank is into House Philadelphia 2015 baby pacifier. So the nonstop news media coverage has already started. Did anyone see the special on ABC last week where the Pope did sort of a virtual audience with U.S. Catholics in 3 cities? So Chicago, McAllen, Texas, and Los Angeles. Did anyone see that? So some Catholics got to speak directly to the Pope via the internet, the link up. Even Stephen Colbert, who couldn't get the Pope to come on his show, is having an all-Catholic guest lineup the first night that the Pope lands in the United States. Social media is already abuzz, so the Pope is already tweeting about it on his handle, which is @Pontifex. Hashtags like Papa in Cuba and Pope in US are already trending. Be sure to follow this one called #JokeWithThePope for a collection of clean jokes about the Pope. So this is a social media campaign sponsored by the Pontifical Mission Society. So here's my favorite. The California drought is so bad that the people in Napa are thinking of asking the Pope to turn the wine back into water. But I'm bummed. Okay, I didn't make that one up. I thought that was pretty funny. All right, my talk today promises what you should know before Pope Francis visits the United States. My plan is first to go over some basics about popes and the papacy, for some of you who maybe aren't Catholic. Then I'm going to debunk some myths about Pope Francis, because there are a couple of them out there. Then I'll unpack some recent news that's come out of the Vatican in the last couple weeks. And then finally, I'll comment a little bit about the news media coverage about the Pope, especially as we prepare for the deluge of it that's going to be coming. So if I don't address something you're interested in or dying to know, or you want my opinion, I'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end. Okay, first some basics. Who and what is a pope? So Catholicism has hierarchical leadership, and the leadership is all ordained, and ordained in the Catholic Church means men. So it starts with priests or deacons here at the bottom of the pyramid, and a priest or a deacon serves a local church community or a parish. Then we have the next level up is a bishop or an archbishop who is in charge of a larger geographic area. So for example, we are in the diocese here of Rockford and with Bishop Malloy. An archbishop is usually of an area that includes a major metropolitan city. So for example, Chicago has an archbishop. From among all the archbishops in the world, some are selected to be cardinals, and the cardinals are the group of men who decide who the pope is. So when the pope dies or the current pope, as we learned with the last pope, steps down, the cardinals get together and choose from among themselves the next person to be pope. And the pope here then is at the top of the pyramid. He's technically the Bishop of Rome, but also the leader worldwide for all Catholics, so all 2.1 billion of us. So not pictured in this pyramid is the laity, or non-ordained people. So some people would put them even below here at the bottom of this pyramid. Now, the Second Vatican Council tried to get away from this hierarchical thinking about the church. It used the words people of God to refer to the fact that all Catholics, all baptized people, have responsibility in the church. But the truth is that when it comes to the institutional leadership, this hierarchical system is still in place. It's worth noting, too, that this hierarchy resembles sort of the medieval social structure at the time, where instead of the Pope, you had the king at the top. Maybe the next level had a duke or some other sorts of royalty. Then you maybe had the merchant class and the serfs and the other peasants or peons down here at the bottom. So we'll come back to this idea of hierarchical leadership and the pyramid when we talk about how the media covers the church. Of course, the current pope right now is Pope Francis. He followed Pope Benedict, who stepped down. So Pope Francis's name when he was born was Jorge Mario Bergoglio, and he was born in Buenos Aires, Argentina in 1936. He was the first-born son of 5 children. His parents were immigrants from Italy to Argentina. Some reports say that his parents were kind of stern and unaffectionate, but he had a close relationship with his grandmother, who taught him a lot about the church. His kindergarten teacher was quoted as saying he was a little demon, but I think he was just a rambunctious little boy. He was actually a good student, and after high school went on to study chemistry and earn a special certificate in that subject. As a young adult, he had something of a normal life, especially for someone who would go on to become pope. He loved soccer, he liked to go dancing, he even worked as a bouncer in a nightclub. But eventually he felt the call to priesthood, and so he entered the seminary and joined the Society of Jesus, commonly known as the Jesuits. So he entered seminary in 1958, and the Jesuit process for ordination is quite long, so he was ordained in 1969. And during that time, he taught, and then after his ordination, he eventually served in some leadership positions for the Jesuits, and even as provincial for the Jesuits in that area of Argentina. Now, during Argentina's dirty war, he had a close friend, a woman, who was among the disappeared. And there are people who believe that he personally, and the church as a whole, could have done a lot more to help victims during that war. Pope Francis was not a leftist Marxist, as some people were during that time, and some members of the church were at that time, but neither was he a rightist or a fan of unbridled capitalism. Instead, he adopted what was called at the time the theology of the people, which emphasized more accompanying poor people on their journey rather than working through government to change it. So John Paul II eventually named him a bishop, elevated him to bishop, and he was named the Archbishop of Buenos Aires in 1998. Again, this was done by John Paul II. John Paul II died, and in 2005, there was a conclave to elect a new bishop. This happens in Rome. What we've learned since then is that Bergoglio actually was the runner-up at that time. So the cardinals are sworn to secrecy, and they're not supposed to tell how the voting goes during a conclave. But at least one bishop has come out recently, we didn't know this at the time, and said that Bergoglio was the runner-up in 2005. The winner, of course, at that time, was Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who went on to become Pope Benedict. So Pope Benedict made the somewhat historic and unusual decision to step down as Pope in 2013, and during that conclave, Bergoglio was elected Pope. So he was the first Jesuit, the first Pope from the Americas, and the first from the global South. So in many ways, a historic papacy. Now, in his 2.5 years as Pope, Francis has made a number of trips outside of Italy, a practice started by John Paul II. He's been to Brazil, Korea, Israel, Albania, France, Turkey, Sri Lanka, the Philippines, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Paraguay. And his 10-day trip to the Americas is actually going to begin in Cuba. So he's going to spend 4 days there from the 19th to the 22nd. So this is, of course, important because Pope Francis was kind of a key player in reestablishing diplomatic relations between Cuba and the United States. On Tuesday, September 22nd, he'll leave Havana and fly to Washington, D.C. He'll be in Washington, D.C. for about 2.5 days. And while he's there, he'll be doing a couple important things. First, he'll be meeting with President Obama in the White House, and he's the third pope to meet with a president in the White House. He'll also celebrate a mass at which he will canonize a saint from the Americas, Junipero Serra, who was a missionary in California and helped found many of the missions there. This canonization is a little bit controversial because while some people see Juniper Serra as a great man for giving up his life in Europe and coming to the Americas to spread Christianity, other people kind of see him as part of the controversial colonial exploitation of native people. So there's probably going to be some protests around that canonization mass. And then finally, on Thursday, Pope Francis will address a joint session of Congress, and he's the first pope to ever do that. So a lot of Catholics and others are very eagerly anticipating and wondering what he's going to say to our elected officials in Washington, D.C. So on Friday, he leaves Washington, D.C. and heads to New York City, where he has an address planned at the United Nations. He'll also be part of an ecumenical service at Ground Zero and another large mass at Madison Square Gardens. And then on Saturday, he heads to Philadelphia, where he will also be doing a mass and then making a brief appearance at the Festival of Families. So this is a global, national, and somewhat global conference that's being held in Philadelphia. It's timed to be near, but shouldn't be confused with the Synod on the Family. So the Synod on the Family is a gathering of bishops in Rome to discuss family issues in Catholicism. It started last year, and it will be concluding at the beginning of October in Rome. So this conference in Philadelphia has prominent speakers, and everyday Catholics will be attending it, and Pope Francis is expected to stop in there. His last event before he heads back to Rome is a huge open-air mass in Philadelphia, which from what I understand is turning out to be the logistical nightmare of the century. So all roads are closed, all bridges are closed, there's no public transportation, so we pray that goes well. So it's a long, arduous trip, and there are many opportunities for the Pope to say things that are meaningful, maybe even controversial. People who are speculating think for sure he's going to talk about capitalism, greed, consumerism, the poor, the environment, maybe even talk about immigration and race relations. Okay, so that's my introduction to Pope and Vatican for everyone. In order to tell you more about the Pope, we're going to play the game Two Truths and a Lie. So how many people know how to play this game? Okay, I'm going to give you 3 statements. 2 are true, 1 is a lie. Your job is to guess which one is the lie. All right, so let's practice here. These are 3 statements about me. I am one of the advisors to the student media at Aurora University. I am a Chicago Bears fan. I love Brussels sprouts. 2 of those are true, and 1 of them is a lie. How many people think the first one is the lie, that I'm not an advisor to student media? Okay. How many people think the second one, I'm a Chicago Bears fan, is the lie? Okay, so some of you. How many think it can't be true that she loves Brussels sprouts? Okay. Yes, it's true that I'm an advisor to student media, along with Dr. Matt Kneller here at Aurora University. We have an online student newspaper, several TV shows, and podcasts. This is my plug for AU Spartan Media. So that one is true. However, I am not a Chicago Bears fan. The Green Bay Packers are my team, and consequently, I'm pretty happy this week. Sorry to all you Bears fans who are not. And that means, yes, it's true, I actually do love Brussels sprouts. Okay, so let's try one that talks a little bit about my relationship to the Pope and the Vatican. So here are 3 statements. Which one do you think is the lie? Is it a lie that I correctly predicted that Bergoglio would be elected Pope in the conclave of 2013? Or is it a lie that an article I wrote about women's ordination got me in trouble with the Vatican under another Pope, Pope John Paul II? Or is it a lie that I've never met Pope Francis in person? Okay, so how many people think number 1 is the lie? Okay. How many people think that I didn't write an article that got me in trouble with the Vatican? That one's the lie. And how many people think that I actually have met Pope Francis, so I'm lying there? Okay, we get kind of evenly divided there. Okay, I wish I could say that I correctly predicted that Bergoglio would become Pope, especially if I were a betting person, because I would have made some money. When I told you that it's been released that he was a runner-up in the previous conclave, no one knew that at the time in 2013. His election surprised many people in the media, even in Catholic media. Many people were discussing that the next pope maybe would not be a European and might be from the global south, but Bergoglio was not on very many top 10 lists, if any. So this one is the lie. So that means that, yes, it's true, I did get in trouble once at the Vatican. More accurately, the magazine that I wrote for got in some trouble with the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith over an article that I wrote about women's ordination. So the article was called Call Waiting, Women Who Want to Be Priests, and I profiled 5 women who felt called to priesthood. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith at the time was headed up by Cardinal Ratzinger, who went on to become Pope Benedict, but at the time the Pope was Pope John Paul II. So I do have that relationship to those popes. And it's also true that I've never met Pope Francis. In fact, I've never met any pope in real life. This is my children with a cardboard cutout of Pope Francis at a church. So it looks like they've met him, but he's not real. And unfortunately, I won't be traveling either to Cuba or to Washington, D.C., New York, or Philadelphia to cover the papal trips. I need to be here to teach my classes, and actually my anniversary is next weekend, so I'm going to spend it with my husband. But I will be doing some commentary, both for the National Catholic Reporter and at least one piece for CNN Opinion, online, which I write for occasionally. Okay. So now let's try some that are about the Pope more specifically. So these are 3 statements about Pope Francis. Which ones are true, and which one do you think is the lie? So is it a lie that Pope Francis is a down-to-earth guy who's chosen not to live in the lush papal apartment or to wear fancy red shoes? Or is it a lie that Pope Francis cares about the poor and has made this topic central to his papacy? Or is this one a lie, that Pope Francis is open to people of other religions, saying it's okay to be spiritual but not religious? Okay, so how many people think the first one is the lie? He's not down to earth. And how many people think that he doesn't care about the poor? It's not the most important part of his papacy. Nobody? And how many people think that he's not open to people of other religions and thinks it's okay to be spiritual but not religious? Boy, you guys are really smart. Okay. It is true that Pope Francis is not comfortable with some of the regal trappings of the papacy. For example, he's much more into a very simple white vestment rather than some of the brocade and velvet and lace that we see Pope Benedict, Cardinal Ratzinger, wearing here. He also surprised everyone when he chose to wear simple black shoes rather than the fancy red shoes that some popes wear. So Pope Benedict was said to be particularly fond of a Prada brand of red shoes. So I love this picture of Pope Francis. This is at World Youth Day in South America, and he just put on one of those disposable yellow rain jackets over him when it started raining, just like everybody else there. While clothing might seem like a relatively unimportant thing, it sends a message, and it sends a visual message, and the Pope sent a lot of these types of visual messages early on in his pontificate. After his election, when after the white smoke comes up in the Vatican and they come out and announce who the new Pope is, he chose not to wear the fancy mozzetta shawl that popes often wear. This is Pope Benedict and Pope John Paul II. And even his gesture was not triumphant like this, but kind of this meek little hi. So this picture of him is where often the cardboard cutouts are of him in this gesture. Other small things. He chose to keep the same pectoral cross or necklace that bishops wear that he had from when he was an archbishop, rather than have a new one. His papal ring is silver instead of gold. And other things beyond clothing. At the end of the conclave, instead of going right into the Vatican or having a car take him somewhere, he got on the bus with the rest of the cardinals and rode back to the hotel where they had been staying and settled up his bill. He paid. He also has chosen not to live in the apostolic palace and instead lives in a much more modest guest house where a number of priests live near the Vatican. So gestures like this endeared him to many people. First of all, social justice Catholics who are like the image of someone with a lot of humility. Also, a lot of non-Catholics who frankly are turned off by some of the wealth and extravagances of the papacy started thinking, wow, this guy's really cool. I have to say, though, there were some traditionalist Catholics who were somewhat upset and angered by his eschewing of these trappings, because for some of them, they are important symbols of their Catholic faith, and they were uncomfortable with him not adopting them. This led to something that's sometimes called the Francis effect. And the Francis effect refers to people now having a more positive feeling about the Catholic Church than they used to have before. And some people even try to measure the Francis effect by the number of people who've maybe returned to the church who had maybe previously quit going to church or being a part of Catholicism. Another group of people who loved all these early visual signs were the media. So the media loves a story that deals with something really concrete, like a pair of shoes. Just a couple weeks ago, we had another media story about the Pope, maybe it was last week, that the Pope decided to just go get a new pair of glasses. So normally this isn't a real substantive type of news story, but instead of, again, being taken by a car and driver, he just walked over to what is comparable, I guess, in Italy to Four Eyes and just started trying on a bunch of different pairs of glasses. So the media loved this story, and it was right up there with hundreds die in Syria, Pope goes to get new glasses. Again, the media likes concrete stories, and we'll talk later about why that fits in with some of their narratives. So yes, this one is true. You guys were mostly right about that. And yes, it's definitely true that the Pope cares about the poor, and he's made this really central to his papacy. This is a picture of him in Bolivia, visiting a favela. I think he's in South America somewhere. Correct me. Brazil, thank you. Brazil, visiting a favela of poor people in Brazil. He often speaks forcefully and often about the dangers of greed, capitalism, overconsumption, and is frequently talking about the need to care for the poor. He also does some symbolic things, like on Holy Thursday, when priests everywhere, and the Pope as well, do a symbolic washing of the feet like Jesus did. He's chosen to wash the feet of some of the most downtrodden people in Rome, so often washing the feet of, say, prisoners in a jail. Also, he's been known, rather than to celebrate his own Mass privately, he just drops in at the noon Mass that's for some of the workers at the Vatican. So, the gardeners and the cleaning crew attend Mass, and he just slips in the back and sits in the back pew and goes to Mass with them. Now, to be fair, previous popes talked about the poor a lot too. But you can see this narrative is arising that says Pope Francis cares about the poor, and then the comparison is that the other popes maybe didn't that much. And that's unfortunately a little oversimplified and not necessarily true about the previous popes. The previous popes talked about other things too, though, that Pope Francis does not. So it is true that this one is the lie. This is a meme that went around the internet and is maybe still going around today, in which it attributes this quote to Pope Francis. "It's not necessary to believe in God to be a good person. In a way, the traditional notion of God is outdated. One can be spiritual but not religious. It's not necessary to go to church and give money. For many, nature can be a church. Some of the best people in history did not believe in God, while some of the worst deeds were done in his name." Now, this is a myth that's going around that's definitely a result of this oversimplified narrative. So, the Pope is open to people of other faiths, but he never said this. And actually, he's quite traditional in his beliefs about the need for God and the need for the church. What's happened is that he becomes associated with liberal thoughts or the Pope of change, and all of a sudden certain things are attributed to him that are not necessarily true. Now, it is true that Pope Francis is a Pope of change. He wants to change a lot of things. Maybe most importantly, he's really interested in reforming the Curia, which is the bureaucracy in the Vatican. But he's actually quite traditional, even conservative, in some of the basic tenets of Catholic doctrine. What you have really is a difference more of style than substance. So it's on what he chooses to emphasize or the way in which he talks about things and just the style of how he presents himself and how he lives. Okay, so you guys got a lot of those right. Let's talk about some of the hot button issues now. So here we have 3 statements about Pope Francis. Pope Francis is open to lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender folks and is likely to change church teaching about homosexuality and gay marriage. Pope Francis is against the ordination of women. Or Pope Francis is green and cares about the earth. So 2 of these are true and 1 of these is a lie. How many people think the first one is the lie? How many people think the second one is a lie, that Pope Francis is really open to women's ordination? And how many people think this one is the lie, that he's not big into the environment? Okay. So this is one of the, another myth that has arisen about Pope Francis that I can guarantee you, and I'm not going to make a lot of predictions here, but that I don't think church teaching on homosexuality is going to change under this pontificate. So the church teaches that homosexuality is wrong and sinful, or homosexual actions are, but he didn't get to be Person of the Year for The Advocate, an LGBT magazine, for nothing. Now, I do believe this no hate tattoo was photoshopped on, though. This quote over here is something that Pope Francis said. "If someone is gay and seeks the Lord with goodwill, who am I to judge?" Who am I to judge? That's probably the most popular quote of this pontificate, or maybe of any pope in a long time. It actually was an off-the-cuff remark that he made to a journalist while aboard the papal plane coming back from World Youth Day. And he's kind of been known for speaking off the cuff, especially with reporters in these casual situations, and it sometimes gets him in trouble. But it's also true that he said in a more thought out piece, so this was in an interview with America magazine, American Catholic magazine, that was done by writing, so he had to sit down and think this out. He said, "A person once asked me in a provocative manner if I approved of homosexuality. I replied with another question. Tell me, when God looks at a gay person, does he endorse the existence of this person with love or reject and condemn this person? We must always consider the person." So Pope Francis has had a more pastoral outreach to people who are lesbian and gay, but he has been very consistent in opposing gay marriage, although in Argentina he talked about agreeing to civil union so that gay marriage would not pass. And he's also very opposed to gay couples adopting children. So again, the content really isn't that much different than previous popes, but it's all in what Pope Francis has decided to emphasize. People know what church teaching is about homosexuality. He doesn't need to be pounding and repeating it. What's different is he tries to be open and have more of a pastoral tone and style. So many the LGBT people, have been encouraged by even this small change. Feminists, not so much. So there is no comparable who am I to judge when it comes to that has feminists or women, Catholic women excited about Pope Francis. And as a person with a background in feminism, I have to say I'm among them. So in fact, a lot of Catholic feminists are pretty disappointed with this Pope, even while acknowledging that he's doing a lot of great things. Francis has pretty traditional views about women, including the need to keep barring them from ordination, which, to be quite honest, is where most institutional power in the church is. He's also big on a Catholic teaching called complementarity, and that's P-L-E, not P-L-I, so not, hey, you look nice today. But complementarity is kind of an idea that biology is destiny, that God created us as men and women, and we're biologically different, and that this somehow means that we have also different social roles. So it's kind of, I sometimes say that both roles are seen as valued, but it's a little bit of like separate but equal. He often uses the phrase special genius when he's referring to women, and this is referencing again this complementarity. It's shorthand for your power lies in being able to be a mother, not be a priest. He also has made a number of blunders when talking about women, using the phrase calling women the strawberry on the cake, and also speaking pejoratively about old maids and about grandmothers. So I think he could use a little PR savvy when it comes to speaking about women. And so that means, yes, this one is also true as well. And as we know from the release of Pope Francis's encyclical over the summer, and I'm not a good person with Latin here, but Laudato Si, I believe is the pronunciation. This is his second encyclical or letter, and it's the first papal encyclical ever to be devoted exclusively to the care of creation. In this letter, which is quite lengthy, he definitely talks about the environmental crisis being caused by, again, greed, unbridled capitalism, and he talks a lot about how it disproportionately affects the poor people. He was very careful not to blame the environmental crisis on overpopulation, and he dedicated a whole section in this letter to reaffirming church teaching against abortion. So there are some people who think that the environmental problems we face are the result of overpopulation, which could be decreased if the Catholic Church did not teach against both contraception, artificial birth control, or abortion. Yet, it is true that a number of politically conservative American Catholics were pretty upset with this encyclical because it did mention climate change and, while it was careful, said that it was man-made, also while holding out that there were other contributions. His approval ratings, and we can talk about whether it's really appropriate for a pope to have approval ratings, actually went down significantly after the release of this encyclical, in America by about 20%. So this encyclical is loved by liberals, including non-religious ones who are excited about a pope who cares about what they see as a really important social issue of our time. But there are conservative Catholics who seem to be growing increasingly concerned about Pope Francis. However, we have to remember that doesn't make Pope Francis a liberal, at least not in the American political sense of what we think of as a liberal. Okay, now to turn to three statements that have to do with some news stories that came out within the last week or so. So here's a couple things that were talked about. Two of these are true and one is a lie. Pope Francis has made major changes to the annulment process, making it easier and cheaper for couples to remarry in the church after divorce. Pope Francis has changed church teaching about whether couples who remarry in the church without an annulment can receive communion. Or Pope Francis has changed the process for absolving women who've had an abortion. These were in the news. How many of you think the first one, that he made changes to the annulment process, is the lie? Not sure. How many people think this one, that he changed church teaching about divorced people getting communion, is the lie? Majority. And how many people think he changed the process for absolving women who have an abortion, is the lie? Okay. Hopefully I can help clarify some of these. Because the way these stories were covered in the mainstream media with the shorthand of headlines sometimes were a little misleading. So it is true that the Pope released some new rules about annulments that had some major changes to them. So for example, he said all annulments should be free. Currently, an annulment, which is a process you go through after you go through a divorce so that you're free to marry in the church again, costs in the hundreds of dollars, usually roughly around $500. Most dioceses will have some sort of sliding scale. But he's saying they should all be free now. He's also getting rid of this extra step that got tacked on in the 80s. So this is a sort of a legal, juridical process, and after a decision is made about whether you get the annulment or not, it has to be kind of retried, and there's the second judgment. So he's saying, let's speed this process up by getting rid of that step. He also said, let's let local bishops decide on the kinds of cases that are particularly evident. So perhaps where there's adultery or where the woman has had an abortion, you don't need to go through all the steps involved for an annulment. So this announcement is part of the Pope's Year of Mercy. So the Catholic Church often has these special years where they celebrate being particularly spiritual, and the Pope has declared one the Year of Mercy, which is a word he uses a lot. It's going to start in December of this December 8th, and that's when these new rules are set to be put in place. So there's a couple interesting things about this news story. First of all, these changes came very quickly. About a year ago, the Pope pulled together a commission to study these issues, and then here he is announcing them and having them implemented by December. That's like lightning fast in the church. It often takes generations for things to happen in the church. Second of all, it does put more power in the hand of a local bishop. So it's kind of going against all this centralization in Rome that we've seen in previous papacies. Again, the focus is always on trying to bring people back to the church. What's interesting is that the number of annulments in the United States has actually decreased sharply in the last 3 decades, from 60,000 in the 80s to 20,000 now. And these are not annulments granted, but cases opened. So it's not that fewer people are getting divorced, but Catholics are choosing not to pursue the annulment process. However, some studies that I looked at said that when you ask Catholics or former Catholics why they don't pursue the annulment process, they don't really mention the hassle or the cost. So these changes, whether they'll have much of an effect on how Catholics perceive annulments, remains to be seen. But this one is true. Okay, this one is the lie. So despite the changes to the annulment process, the Pope did not change church teaching about marriage. So just to have a little primer on church teaching about marriage, the Catholic Church believes that when you marry someone, it's forever. Therefore, even if you were to get a legal divorce, you're technically still married to that person. So you're fine as long as that's as far as it goes, and you're still free to receive the sacraments, including communion. But if you are to remarry without getting an annulment, again, you're still married to that first person in the eyes of the church. So then that would be seen as adultery. And at that point, Catholics are barred from the sacraments. So an annulment is not a Catholic divorce. An annulment is a decision saying that the marriage did not have the conditions to be a true sacramental marriage in the first place. Therefore, in a way, that first marriage was not valid, and you are then free to remarry someone else. So the Pope has not changed this teaching. However, this is being discussed. So that Synod on the Family that I mentioned that's going to conclude in a couple weeks in Rome, there are a number of bishops around the world, there are some bishops around the world, namely Cardinal Kasper from Germany, who has proposed that in some instances that this rule be changed so that Catholics who remarry without an annulment and are divorced can still go receive the sacraments. However, I would say this is very controversial, and there's been a lot of pushback about not changing this, and Pope Francis has not really weighed in on this one way or the other. I would be very surprised if this changed, but it's possible. It's being discussed. But right now, that one's the lie. So that means that it is true that Pope Francis also announced last week that he was changing the process for absolution of women who are seeking forgiveness for the sin of abortion. But this news story is a little tricky also. So a number of headlines kind of overstated what happened, leading some people to think that the church's teaching about abortion had changed. So what the Pope is really saying is that women, again, during this year of mercy that starts in December, can go to a priest to confess, and Catholics do confess their sins to a priest and are absolved through the priest, that they can go to a priest to be absolved of this sin. So abortion is considered a serious enough sin that otherwise women are, and men who help procure one, are required to confess to a bishop. Now, the truth is, in nearly every diocese in America, bishops have already given local priests that power. So Pope Francis making this announcement a couple weeks ago doesn't change much in the United States. It's also true that John Paul II and Pope Benedict did the same thing during special years of their pontificate. So this is not something new that Pope Francis is doing that no one else has ever done. The day this news was released, there also was another bit of news that was released at the same time. So Pope Francis kind of balanced this news story that made the church appear more open to, or you could even say liberal, I'm going to put that in quotes, with some news that he was also being open to another group of people who are outside the church. That is a traditionalist order, or a traditionalist group of Catholics who refuse to accept the reforms of Vatican II. This is the Society of St. Pius X, or sometimes called the Lefebvrists. And so he said that Lefebvrist priests, who are technically outside the church right now, would be able to grant indulgences during this year of mercy. So he kind of balanced one side with the other. Now, there have been a number of articles criticizing this, saying this whole emphasis on women needing to seek forgiveness for abortions sort of portrays women as victims in societies like ours where they have that reproductive right. Again, Pope Francis not changing church teaching on something, but trying to have a more inclusive pastoral approach and trying to bring people into the church rather than judge them and push them out for not being perfect. Okay, and so finally some comments about Pope Francis as he's covered by the media. And I'm not here to bash the media. I am the media. I'm part of the media. But I think it helps people to be a little bit, be good consumers of media, especially when you're looking at how the media covers things like religion. So first, I think this Pope is pretty media savvy. He's one of the most retweeted people on Twitter. He certainly ends up on many magazine covers, including some you wouldn't expect a Pope to be on, like Rolling Stone. I think he sees the media as a pastoral tool, and he's happy to use it. So this is kind of his attitude in a lot of things. Rather than rail against something about how evil it is, he just accepts it like this is just the way it is. We have an internet. And then uses that tool to bring people closer to God or back to the church. But I think some good media literacy would to be wary of oversimplified media narratives about the Pope. So I've mentioned a couple of these already. The media, just by virtue of what their job is, has a certain attraction for certain storylines. So one, for example, is conflict. I often tell my students, hey, everybody getting along, that's not news. That's why you never see a news story about that. Conflict is the root of all good stories, whether it's a novel, a movie, or a news story. The media loves stories with conflict, and sometimes the media will hype up conflict to exaggerate the type of conflict, or they'll cover the conflict to the exclusion of other nuances in the story. I think what the conflict that you'll see when the Pope is visiting is this storyline: liberal Pope versus conservative politicians or conservative Catholics. So already I've seen stories like, what does Donald Trump think about the Pope, or how are they going to, conflict? And what about Boehner? And he invited the Pope to address Congress, etc. Another narrative that the media likes is this first-person story of an individual, and especially if that person is a hero in some way. So remember when we talked about the pyramid? It's a lot easier to focus on the one person at the top and make that person a hero than to tell the story of all the peons at the bottom. And so the media often likes to cover people as if they're celebrities and really likes the narrative of the hero. There's also a lot of comparing and contrasting going on. So you'll see a comparison of this pope to previous popes. I kind of call this the good pope, bad pope narrative. And then, like I said, you have the media that's very attracted to visual stories, especially in this day of video, the importance of video. So rather than get into a lot of nuances about doctrine, they like to show things that are visual. And so I think when the Pope is here, you're going to see a lot of photos and video that sort of emphasize what's going on. I also would ask people to beware of media who cover religion and the Pope as if it's a political story. So religion, the Pope is not the president or prime minister, and media that cover, they're kind of used to covering politics, and often people who cover religion stories like this are not dedicated religion reporters, and so that's an oversimplification again and doesn't really understand the nuances of religion or church. So this is where I put a plug in for if you want good media coverage of religion, to consume some alternative media. I've got nothing against the mainstream media, but I can tell you it's very different to write for the National Catholic Reporter than it is to write for CNN. So CNN calls me and asks me to write stories like, Heidi, the Pope just said that dogs go to heaven. Can you write an article about that? And while that's, I know, very of interest to pet owners, it's not the most serious story about the Pope. NCR has a dedicated reporter who lives in Rome and who travels with the Pope on all of his trips, Josh McElwee, and he does a great job, a lot of really in-depth reporting, and we have reporters who are going to be doing a lot of writing about the Pope's visit. It's a great site. NCR Online is where you go there to get that coverage. You could also follow me on Facebook, and then you'll get all those stories. I'd like to conclude with a story. So over the summer, I wrote a book that profiles a Catholic feminist theologian. Her name is Elizabeth Johnson. And one of the stories she told me that was the most pivotal in her life involved the visit of a pope to America. So in 1979, John Paul II came to the United States, and one of the visits he made was to a group of nuns, or women religious, who were gathered in Washington, D.C. Sister Elizabeth Johnson was there. The leader of the women's religious group got up and made a speech in which she welcomed the Pope, but she also offered some challenging words, which was kind of gutsy, saying that Catholic women in America wanted the Pope to know that they felt that all roles in the church were not open to them. Elizabeth Johnson talked about how it was one of the most important days of her life, and it was the day she became a feminist, she said. So the Pope is not coming to Aurora. He's not even coming to Chicago. And in some ways, most of us will watch it on TV as if he were as far away as being back in Rome. But I do think he's going to be saying some really provocative things that are meant specifically for us as Americans. I think papal trips have a way of changing people, like they did Elizabeth Johnson, and sometimes in ways that you might not have expected. So I'm excited to see how this Pope, who's been a Pope of surprises since the day he was named, I'm really excited to see what he's going to have to say to us and how he's going to be covered. So thank you. Those are my comments. And now I'd like to take questions from you. So I think I left some good amount of time here. Yes. Okay. Yes, you superwoman.
So on the trips that the Pope makes, like he's coming to the States, what does he normally do on these trips?
A lot of public speaking. So a lot of, pressing the flesh and meeting with people, but a lot of public speaking. There are some private meetings also planned. So for example, it's recently, I think yesterday it was released that most likely he'll meet with Castro while in Cuba. Some reporters are already asking, is he planning to meet with some victims of clerical sex abuse while he's here? That hasn't been confirmed, but if it happens, it'll be private. So there are private meetings as well. I have friends who work at America magazine in New York, and since America is a Jesuit magazine and the Pope is a Jesuit, they're pretty much expecting him to stop by their offices too. But mostly it's the big public events. And not all of them are open to everyone, and there's been some talk about the cost of tickets. I've seen some journalists also complaining about the cost to send the media. So I think it was in the tens of thousands or thousands of dollars even for the media to to get a seat at the papal mass in Philadelphia. But yeah, a lot of public events and addresses, all of which, by the way, are being carried live on various media and the internet, so you can watch them. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes?
I was wondering what your comment was about how this pope has interacted with the women religious. You know, the previous pope had, you know, kind of put them under sanctions.
Yes. So the book I wrote is about a woman who's actually, you know, been in trouble with some hierarchy in the Vatican and some bishops here in the United States. So again, I think he is going out of his way to do things that send a message that he's more a pope of being conciliatory. Previous pope was, you know, kind of in attack mode in that way, very careful, very much about doctrine and making sure that everyone's towing the line, and nervous about certain groups of women religious who were doing things that seemed like they might have been stepping over that line. So yeah, I think it's over, you know, and he kind of called it to a conclusion a little quicker than some people thought he would. I noticed the other night when I was watching that special on ABC where he was doing the live thing with the people in 3 different cities. There were about 100 people in the audience, and he was speaking to the 2 people who had been prepped to talk to him. And he interrupted and said, "I want to talk to that nun back there who works with the immigrants." And he could tell she was a nun because she was habited, had a habit on, so she might have been from a more traditionalist order. But I think he is going out of his way to try to reach out to women religious. And, you know, women religious, many of whom are feminists, they're not like bowled over by him, but they certainly agree that it's better than the previous papacies where, you know, people were always nervous about letters going off to Rome and people getting in trouble. So, thank you. Yes?
Is it true that he's going to give speeches in Spanish?
Yes, so that's what I've heard. And the special that on ABC as well, he spoke mostly in Spanish, but a couple times in English. So yeah, he grew up in Argentina, so his native language is Spanish. So yeah, I think the Latino church in America, which is growing and becoming even larger, is going to be able to listen to him in their native language. Things will be translated, of course, too. Yes?
So when he goes to all these other countries, does he do a lot of public speaking there too, like he is doing in the U.S., or is it for, like, does he go over and help people? Like, does he go to poor countries too and do things there, or is it mainly just like?
I mean, you're not going to see the Pope, like, you know, building a Habitat for Humanity house, in part because he has kind of a full schedule and you know, it would probably cause some problems if he tried to do that. But I do think he is someone who tries to be down with the people. And so it'll be interesting to see during this trip, too, how he tries to maybe escape from some of the official things and try to be with actual people who are more, you know, the real people. But yeah, in other countries, he does the same thing. So that's where we get a lot. That's how we learn to know about what he thinks, mostly from these letters he writes, but also he gives speeches. All popes give a weekly address as well, called the Angelus Address, on Wednesdays, and so you can, all this stuff is on Vatican website if you want to read and find out more about him. Yes?
Do you think this might be this might be the beginning steps of like more of like an evolution of more free-thinking popes?
Yeah, I hope so. I don't know if it is or not. I mean, it's hard to say. I grew up in a church that was right after Vatican II when the church was hopeful and open. So that was my experience as a child and a teenager and a young adult. Once I started working for the church, for Catholic publications, the church became more conservative, more rigid. So now this looks to me like we're kind of going the other direction a little bit, and I'm hopeful about that, but I'm not making any predictions. I hope this Pope lives a long life and is able to accomplish a lot while he's Pope. Yes?
I understand that I don't know if it's unique to America, but declining numbers in Catholicism.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's true worldwide, but how do you see him impacting?
So this is something that people like to discuss a lot. Has the Francis effect really borne fruit in people returning to the church, you know, coming to church every week, you know, maybe, you know, coming back and receiving sacraments or something like that? There's not a lot of evidence that there's this huge, you know, return, but I do think that the PR, you know, effect is positive. So just for people to not have such a negative view of the church is sometimes the first step. If someone, an individual or a family has really been hurt by the church or feels they haven't been accepted by the church for many years, they're probably not going to turn on a dime. But I think all of this can only help. So yeah, I don't think there's a lot of evidence of that yet, but we're looking for it. Yes?
You touched on it a little bit when you talked about people getting divorced versus people getting an annulment.
Mm-hmm.
It seems one of the issues with the issue of same-sex marriage and other things that people are hoping for more progress from the Pope than they're going to get, I think, stems from the failing to perceive the distinction between the legal contract, the state legal arrangement of marriage, and the Catholic
Sacrament of marriage.
Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I'm not, an expert on his early life in Argentina, but from the things I did read about it, when there was the push for gay marriage in Argentina, he spoke very forcefully against gay marriage, but he was someone who was willing to take the middle road of saying, let's have civil unions, which is sort of a way of separating. Yes, there's a way for LGBT people to somehow legally get married, but it would be separate from what we call marriage, because people like to reserve, some Catholics like to reserve that word for between a man and a woman and the sacrament. So yeah, there are a lot of people who are saying the church maybe shouldn't be in the business of legal marriage, that would be completely separate from the church ceremony, would be completely separate from that. But there are also Catholics who believe that LGBT people should be able to have a church marriage too.
But like during the Catholic marriage, the Catholic sacrament of marriage, there is also a point at which one signs a legal document.
Right.
A witness has to do it. It's clearly a state
Right.
event that occurs within the context
Right.
of that statute.
Yeah, so I think some people see that as as a middle step. So if we can't get the church to change its teaching about LGBT people having, what I personally believe is the right that all human beings should have to marry, I think they see it as a step. Well, let's at least separate what the church does from the legal side so that at least Americans can all have the right to marriage. So yeah, those are different things. Yes?
You talked about the church teaching against contraceptives, but they also support Planned Parenthood, and they also teach about they should wait till marriage to have sex. Don't you think that counteracts?
Okay, the church does not support Planned Parenthood. Pretty sure about that. The church is actually pretty opposed to Planned Parenthood because Planned Parenthood not only offers contraception, but it also offers, or at least refers people to abortion. So they're pretty consistent in believing that sex is something between a man and a woman when they're married, and that every act of sex should be open to the procreation of children. So that's church teaching on marriage. Now, how many American Catholics believe all those pieces of that belief is not a large number, but that is church teaching on marriage and sex before marriage. So actually they are pretty consistent. Yes?
I'm going to try to explain this without stepping on any toes.
Okay.
So, what would you say is the response to the Pope, utilizing the media? This is where I don't want to step on toes. Maybe an older generation, maybe young generations are addicted to media and stuff, and now we have the Pope who shouldn't. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so, yeah, I think I do. So I'm a communication professor. I work for the media. I'm pretty pro-media. And I actually think that...
Think about the response, not your response as a media.
So people who would criticize him for using the media?
Yeah.
People have the right to their opinion, I guess. But I think, I think if we look in the church's history, the church has always used the things that were available at the time to, improve the church. So, when people were writing on papyrus, the church wrote their things down on papyrus. And now we don't do that anymore. We tweet. So I think it's okay for the church to tweet. But, that said, I'm not going to, harangue some person who thinks the media is evil and the Pope shouldn't be doing it. But I think the proof is in the pudding, that all these people, I don't have this up here, how many people are following? Here we go. 7 million. And, there's he's reaching a lot of people, more people than ever darken the doors of a church building. So it's pretty effective. That's a good question. Any other? burning questions. Yes.
I believe I heard a couple of stories this past year on how he has started to clean house in the Vatican a little bit.
Yes.
In terms of some of their practices, bookkeeping, accounting. He's moved individuals out of positions of power who perhaps were not appropriate for. Can you talk a little, and what impact that may have on the future church?
Yeah, so this is a side of the Pope that non-Catholics probably don't understand as much, and it's a little bit technical, but it might be among the most influential thing he does as Pope. It's hard for me to be a little bit objective because one of the people he removed was the guy that got me in trouble for the article that I wrote, Cardinal Bertoni. So I was not sad to see him go. And I didn't get in any, nothing personally happened to me, but it was really kind of a difficult time for the religious order that publishes that magazine. So yeah, I think this reform of the Curia is a huge thing, and especially in terms of some of the issues around money, that these, if he's able to accomplish them, are going to be among the most important things that he does. It's also why there are people who pray every night for his health and safety, because it's sad to say there are people who are actually worried that the kinds of reforms he's doing there are so threatening to some people in their livelihoods that his life may be at stake. So yeah, that's true. Yes?
I'm curious to what extent you think a pope can actually change even what Catholics believe. I think he's obviously had a great impact on a lot of people's thoughts about the church who aren't Catholics. But I was raised a Catholic, and one thing that was a big topic the last time I went to church, which was quite a number of years ago, was transubstantiation and whether people actually believe that the Eucharist is turned into the body or whether that's just symbolic. And opinion polls had just been done, and the church was kind of freaking out that most Catholics didn't believe that.
And it's sort of one of our big beliefs, yes.
Yeah, it's a core belief, and so I'm curious, when a pope says something like climate change is a problem and there are real social impacts. You mentioned the public opinion poll that hit, which is really ironic that there is a poll. I'm just curious, when a pope says something, to what extent do Catholics feel like they need to actually make changes, or to what extent they just feel it's just another thing that the pope
Celebrity talking. That's a great question. And I have to say, whether what the Pope says affects individual Catholics partly depends on how they view the Pope. So if you don't think the Pope is very important, you don't think he's the vicar of Christ, you don't think he's the successor of Peter and a pretty important person, then it probably doesn't matter that much to you. And there are a number of more, I'm going to air quote this word, progressive or liberal Catholics for whom the Pope, they haven't taken what different popes throughout history have said very seriously, so they've kind of tuned him out. That said, there are a lot of Catholics who do take seriously what the Pope says, and not just because they agree with him. I was reading on a traditionalist Catholic website the other day. It was about the encyclical, and it was kind of top 10 things you need to know about the encyclical. And this was written by a really conservative Catholic blogger. And the 10th thing you needed to know was, can we just ignore this, or do we have to pay attention to this? And he said, yes, you do have to pay attention to this, even though he knows that most of his readers are climate change deniers who think the Pope shouldn't be discussing matters of science. But he was saying, no, this is our Pope saying this, and therefore we have to pay attention to it. So I do think he is still influential. And again, I think often we think from an American perspective. And whenever the Pope says anything, I know, our newspaper is always like, what does that mean? And we think with our American hat on. And often he's not speaking to us at all. He's speaking to people in entirely different cultures with entirely different perspectives. That's what's so exciting about this trip, because on this trip, he's speaking to us. So, not from Cuba, but when he gets here, he's going to be definitely aiming his words at American Catholics. Does that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions? Well, thank you again so much for coming. I appreciate it.